Forget the polished trophies and the glittering legacy they sold you on the evening news. 27 years old, a massive multi-million-dollar contract, the undisputed captain of the most legendary sports empire in Boston. And then, a sudden collapse on a remarkably quiet summer afternoon. His brave heart simply could not take it. But what if I told you the official story was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion? For decades, wealthy franchise executives and elite cardiologists have desperately guarded a terrifying reality. Today, we are pulling back the heavy velvet curtain on the dark side of fame. Why do highly classified medical charts still whisper unsettling contradictions? Why was a vibrant, seemingly invincible athlete allowed to return to the hardwood after a massive, undeniable warning sign? The secret is out. This was not just a tragic biological anomaly. This was a billion-dollar machine absolutely terrified of losing its golden boy, desperately covering up a chilling narrative where he potentially suffered from dependency. You have been fed a sanitized fairy tale designed to protect a highly lucrative brand. Now, we are exposing the incredibly uncomfortable truth they tried to bury deep under that legendary green parquet floor. But to truly understand how a globally adored icon ultimately found himself in the center of a scandal due to serious accusations, we must travel far away from the flashing cameras. We must go back to the very beginning, to the harsh, unforgiving streets where his journey started, setting the invisible stage for an entirely fatal choice. The cracked, sun-baked asphalt courts of East Baltimore are notoriously unforgiving. They are not just playgrounds, they are a brutal, relentless testing ground. It is a place where a young boy either learns to fight fiercely for his space or gets entirely swallowed whole by the unforgiving, dangerous streets that surround him. For this tall, gangly young man, the rhythmic, echoing sound of the bouncing basketball was not merely a childhood pastime, it was a desperate, highly calculated ticket out. It was a fragile lifeline thrown over a turbulent, terrifying sea of criminal temptations and the constant threat of street violence. Interestingly enough, if you ask the people who shared those rough courts with him, he was never the loudest, most boastful voice in the crowd. In fact, those who knew him best back then described a remarkably quiet, almost painful shyness. It was a stark, surprising contrast to the flamboyant, ego-driven personalities that usually dominate the fiercely competitive sports landscape. But make no mistake, behind those calm, incredibly observant eyes burned an unquenchable, terrifying will to win. He possessed a silent fire, an intense, almost monastic dedication that kept him shooting hoops entirely alone under the dim, flickering streetlights, long after all the other neighborhood kids had abandoned the court. He channeled absolutely every single ounce of his youthful energy into perfecting his physical craft. He was actively building a massive, impenetrable fortress of discipline around himself, using the game to keep the neighborhood's toxic influences firmly at bay. That quiet, relentless determination slowly but surely forged him into a genuine local legend. He became a high school phenomenon who seemed absolutely destined for global greatness. It was a deafening success on a local level, the exact kind of explosive, undeniable talent that makes prestigious college recruiters practically salivate at the mouth. But as we will soon see, this triumphant cinematic escape from the incredibly tough, dangerous streets of his youth was secretly, quietly, laying the foundational bricks for a fatal choice that would ultimately lead to unimaginable, widespread sorrow. The higher you climb, the harder the fall, and his ascent was just beginning. When he finally stepped onto the sprawling, prestigious college campus of Northeastern University, he did not just blend in, he immediately took over. The entire collegiate basketball world quickly realized they were witnessing the undeniable birth of something truly extraordinary, a talent that comes around perhaps once in a generation. He effortlessly became the undisputed glittering star of his university, consistently leaving seasoned, cynical experts entirely speechless with his fluid, almost feline grace and his completely ice-cold composure under immense, crushing pressure. Veteran coaches and deeply frustrated rivals alike began quietly referring to him as the silent assassin. He absolutely never taunted his defenders, he never beat his chest, and he never provided flashy quotes to the sports reporters. He simply dismantled opposing, highly ranked teams with the cold, calculated surgical precision of a master craftsman. But this level of perfection did not come naturally. It was paid for in sweat and solitude. Every single high-stakes game was preceded by countless hours of meticulous, agonizing preparation. It was a relentless, punishing routine that perfectly showcased his total, consuming obsession with athletic dominance. He would spend hours upon hours silently visualizing his offensive moves, obsessively studying his opponent's microscopic weaknesses on grainy videotapes, and pushing his own physical limits until his muscles practically screamed for mercy. He was the absolute perfect student of the game, a demanding coach's ultimate dream. He seemed completely, entirely immune to the dazzling, dangerous distractions that so often derail young, suddenly famous athletes who find themselves surrounded by adoration. The entire eager nation was watching closely as the heavily anticipated 1987 professional draft rapidly approached. It was acting as a golden, life-altering gateway to the wealthiest, most glamorous professional league in the entire world. It was universally supposed to be the absolute happiest, most validating day of his entire life, the ultimate, glorious reward for so many years of grueling, painful sacrifice in those empty, echoing gyms. Yet, as he proudly walked across that brightly lit stage, putting on that deeply iconic green hat and smiling brightly for the flashing cameras, the secret is out. Absolutely nobody could have possibly guessed what awaited him. He was stepping directly into the incredibly suffocating, toxic shadow of a devastating whispered franchise curse. His highly celebrated arrival in the proud city of Boston would be immediately, tragically haunted by a terrifying ghost from the very recent past, setting the stage for a drama that no one could have ever written. To truly comprehend the immense, crushing psychological weight placed upon the shoulders of this newly drafted rookie, you have to look exactly 1 year into the past. The year was 1986, and the Boston sports empire was supposedly entering a brand new, glorious, golden era. They had just drafted another phenomenal, unbelievably talented athlete, a vibrant young man who was universally expected to carry the glittering torch for the next decade. But then, the unthinkable happened. Just 2 agonizingly short days after shaking hands with the commissioner on national television, that young man's heart could not take it, and he tragically passed away. The city was instantly plunged into a collective state of pure, unadulterated shock. Official reports whispered that he had suffered from dependency, an incredibly fatal reaction to illicit substances that entirely destroyed his incredibly bright future before it even began. The proud, arrogant franchise was suddenly paralyzed, brought entirely to its knees by an unprecedented wave of public grief and relentless, aggressive media scrutiny. The front office was accused of horrific negligence, of looking the other way, while their athletes made devastatingly poor choices. This was the incredibly toxic, paranoid environment waiting for our hero when he arrived in 1987. The locker room was still heavily haunted by that fresh, terrifying ghost. Every time the executives looked at their new draft pick, they did not just see a promising player, they saw a massive, terrifying liability. They were utterly terrified that history might somehow repeat itself. The pressure on this young man from Baltimore was absolutely astronomical. He was not just expected to play a game, he was silently burdened with the impossible task of healing a completely broken, traumatized organization and proving that the team was not suffering from some kind of sinister, inescapable curse. But breaking through the incredibly thick defensive walls of that legendary locker room proved to be a completely different kind of nightmare. When our young captain finally put on the practice jersey, he immediately found himself firmly trapped behind absolute titans of the sport. We are talking about legendary, hardened veterans who had already secured multiple championship rings and who cast incredibly massive, intimidating shadows over everyone else in the building. These older men were notoriously harsh, incredibly demanding, and completely unforgiving to newcomers. For his entire first professional season, he was essentially a highly paid spectator. He spent nearly all of his time sitting on the cold, hard wood of the bench, watching the action from afar, playing mere minutes per game. For a young man who had just experienced a genuinely deafening success in college, being suddenly relegated to a background role was a uniquely painful, humiliating test of his mental fortitude. The local sports reporters, completely devoid of any patience or empathy, immediately began sharpening their knives. The newspapers started aggressively publishing articles openly questioning his talent, viciously labeling him a disappointment, and wondering aloud if the deeply traumatized front office had made yet another catastrophic, multi-million-dollar mistake. Yet those who watched the closed-door practices saw a completely different story unfolding. While the media mercilessly mocked him, he absolutely refused to complain. He never once publicly demanded more playing time. Instead, he quietly absorbed the sheer greatness surrounding him. He studied the intricate footwork of the veterans, memorized their fiercely competitive mentalities, and spent countless grueling hours in the empty gymnasium long after the established stars had driven home in their luxury cars. He was quietly, meticulously sharpening his weapons in the absolute darkest, loneliest corners of the arena, preparing for the exact moment when the heavy golden door of opportunity would finally swing open. Time, however, is incredibly undefeated, and even the most seemingly invincible titans must eventually step aside and watch their empires crumble. As the calendar turned to the early 1990s, the heavily celebrated old guard of the team began physically falling apart. Chronic back injuries, deteriorating knees, and sheer exhaustion finally caught up with the aging legends. The legendary franchise was suddenly staring directly into the terrifying abyss of mediocrity. The highly demanding fans were panicking, the owners were incredibly anxious, and someone desperately needed to seize the reins of power. It was exactly at this incredibly precarious, highly volatile moment that the quiet kid from Baltimore finally stepped directly into the blinding, scorching spotlight. The transformation was absolutely breathtaking to witness. He exploded onto the scene, suddenly averaging over 20 points a game, slicing heavily defended paths to the basket with a smooth, terrifying grace that completely paralyzed his opponents. He was no longer the quiet kid on the bench. He was rightfully named the new captain of the most storied franchise in the entire history of the sport. By 1992, he had earned a highly coveted spot among the absolute elite players of the world, signing incredibly lucrative, life-altering contracts. He was completely universally adored, mobbed by thousands of people wherever he went, and hailed as the ultimate savior of the city. But as we all know, the dark side of fame is always waiting patiently in the shadows, constantly sharpening its claws. With immense power and unimaginable wealth comes an entirely different, highly dangerous set of pressures. The relentless, grueling travel schedules, the impossible expectations to carry an entire organization on his back night after night, and the constant, blinding glare of the media began taking a heavily hidden toll. He looked absolutely invincible on the glossy magazine covers, a perfect physical specimen entirely at the very peak of human athletic performance. But deep inside his immensely powerful chest, a deeply terrifying, catastrophic, biological clock had already silently begun to tick down, and absolutely no one, not his coaches, not his adoring family, and certainly not the millions of people watching him on television, had the slightest terrifying clue of the nightmare that was about to unfold on the hardwood floor. The 29th of April, 1993. It was supposed to be a routine, albeit highly contested, professional playoff matchup. The energy in the legendary Boston arena was absolutely electric, with thousands of wildly passionate spectators practically blowing the roof off the building. The hometown heroes were fiercely battling the team from Charlotte, and our captain was doing exactly what he did best, gracefully dominating the hardwood. He was 27 years old, standing at the absolute zenith of his physical prowess, radiating pure athletic invincibility. But then, in a terrifying fraction of a second, the unthinkable happened. He was casually jogging back on defense, completely untouched by any opposing player. Suddenly he stumbled. His incredibly strong legs simply gave out beneath him, and he crashed violently to the polished floor. The roaring cheers of the masses instantly morphed into a chilling, suffocating silence. You could see the sheer, unadulterated panic in the wide eyes of his teammates. The expressions of the coaching staff shifted from intense focus to absolute horror. He lay there, staring up at the blinding arena lights, looking profoundly disoriented and deeply confused. The medical staff rushed the floor, their hearts pounding in their chests. Miraculously, he managed to stand up and slowly walk to the bench. But here is the detail that still makes medical professionals completely shudder to this very day. After a brief rest, the coaching staff actually allowed him to check back into the heavily contested game. He played a few more minutes, his body clearly struggling, before finally signaling that he simply could not continue. How on earth did an elite medical staff allow a visibly compromised star athlete to return to a professional basketball game after collapsing out of nowhere? Was it the blinding pressure of the playoffs or a catastrophic lapse in judgment? The dark side of fame often means pushing the human body far beyond its natural limits, but this highly questionable decision would soon be heavily scrutinized by the entire nation. The very next morning, the proud city of Boston woke up entirely holding its collective breath. The franchise immediately assembled what the local press quickly dubbed a magnificent dream team of elite, highly respected cardiologists at one of the most prestigious medical facilities in the entire region. The captain underwent a grueling, exhausting battery of intense, highly invasive physical examinations. For days, behind heavily closed doors, the absolute brightest medical minds fiercely debated the terrifying anomalies flashing across their high-tech monitors. When the heavily guarded door finally opened, the doctors delivered a verdict so brutal, so utterly devastating, that it completely shattered the young athlete's entire universe. They diagnosed him with a severe, highly dangerous condition, focal cardiomyopathy. In simple terms, a crucial part of his immensely powerful heart muscle was severely damaged and heavily scarred. The medical expert sat directly across from the superstar and delivered a completely uncompromising, chilling reality. His professional basketball career was permanently, entirely over. The doctors looked him directly in the eyes and explicitly warned him that if he ever attempted to play competitive sports again, his heart would simply not be able to handle the immense strain. Stepping back onto the court would be the equivalent of leaping out of an airplane without a parachute. Imagine, for just a moment, the unimaginable psychological weight of that incredibly dark room. A young man defining his entire existence by his deafening success on the basketball court, suddenly being told that his absolute greatest passion was now a ticking time bomb quietly waiting inside his own chest. But to truly grasp what happened next, you must deeply understand the unique, heavily fortified psychology of a globally recognized professional athlete. Since they are small children, these extraordinary individuals are aggressively conditioned to completely ignore pain, to aggressively push through massive physical barriers, and to absolutely never ever accept defeat. When an incredibly powerful athlete is told something is entirely impossible, their immediate, deeply ingrained instinct is to aggressively prove everyone wrong. The crushing pressure of his elite status, the incredibly heavy expectations of the entire city, and the staggering reality of his multi-million-dollar contracts created an incredibly toxic, undeniable cocktail of profound denial. He simply completely refused to accept that his magnificent career was suddenly snatched away. He felt fine. He looked incredibly strong. How could these men in white coats take away his entire identity based on a few squiggly lines on a piece of medical paper? In absolute secrecy, a deeply desperate, highly controversial search for a second opinion began. He and his incredibly tight-knit inner circle began aggressively seeking out another doctor, someone, absolutely anyone, who would be willing to openly challenge the devastating verdict of the original medical dream team. They were desperately praying for a medical loophole, a completely different diagnosis that would miraculously allow him to return to the sport he loved more than anything in the world. And soon the secret is out. They finally found a highly decorated, incredibly confident physician who was entirely willing to tell the desperate captain exactly what he so desperately wanted to hear, setting the massive stage for a fatal choice that would shock the entire sports world to its absolute core. The human mind is an incredibly powerful, incredibly dangerous fortress when it absolutely refuses to accept a devastating reality. Following that incredibly grim, completely heartbreaking verdict from the first group of elite specialists, the captain and his deeply worried inner circle embarked on a highly secretive, deeply controversial quest. They were absolutely desperate to find someone, anyone, in the vast medical field who would look at those exact same terrifying test results and offer a completely different narrative. They were actively searching for a miraculous loophole, a way to keep the dream alive. And eventually, after knocking on many highly guarded doors, they finally found one. A highly decorated, remarkably confident cardiologist stepped directly into the picture, a man who was entirely willing to heavily dispute the deeply concerning findings of his esteemed colleagues. This second doctor sat down with the completely anxious family in a luxurious, heavily wood-paneled office and delivered a diagnosis that felt like a miraculous, sudden burst of sunlight piercing through a terrifyingly dark storm. He claimed the underlying issue was not a severely damaged, permanently scarred heart muscle at all. Instead, he smoothly and confidently explained it away as a relatively common, entirely manageable condition known as neurocardiogenic syncope. In layman's terms, he looked the wealthy superstar directly in the eyes and told him that he simply suffered from incredibly common fainting spells, a minor glitch in his nervous system that could easily be controlled with medication and hydration. The sheer, unadulterated relief that instantly washed over the athlete's family was absolutely palpable. You have to deeply understand the immense psychological weight that was suddenly, miraculously, lifted off their heavy shoulders. The superstar had built his entire identity, his massive fortune, and his deafening success entirely on his extraordinary, unparalleled physical abilities. Suddenly, he was given the ultimate, highly coveted green light. He was explicitly told he could safely return to the highly competitive professional arena, back to the incredibly demanding lifestyle he loved so deeply. But looking back through the heavily fogged lens of history, we must pause and ask the truly uncomfortable, deeply scandalous questions that still heavily haunt this specific, highly controversial decision. What truly motivated this second diagnosis? Was it a genuine, honest medical misinterpretation of incredibly complex cardiovascular data? Or was the incredibly powerful allure of treating a globally recognized athletic icon simply too intoxicating to resist? Some highly cynical, deeply connected insiders heavily suspect that an immense, invisible pressure was silently applied from the upper echelons of the sporting world, suggesting that wealthy executives desperately wanted the highly valuable captain back on the polished hardwood floor, completely regardless of the terrifying risks involved. While the superstar publicly celebrated his supposed medical clearance with bright smiles and press conferences, an entirely different, deeply unsettling narrative was quietly unfolding behind heavily closed laboratory doors. The original dream team of highly respected doctors, the very experts who had explicitly warned him never to play competitive sports again, were absolutely stunned by the new, dangerously optimistic diagnosis. But here is exactly where the story takes a sharp, terrifying turn directly into the dark side of fame. Why did these highly experienced, deeply concerned professionals remain so surprisingly quiet in the public eye? Whispers began to heavily circulate through the most exclusive, heavily guarded corridors of the medical community. The secret is out. Highly confidential rumors suggested that the first team of doctors had seen something deeply troubling in his preliminary blood work, something that went far, far beyond a simple structural cardiac defect. There were hushed, highly sensitive conversations taking place in private country clubs and locked boardrooms about potential red flags, indicating that he heavily suffered from dependency on highly illicit, severely banned performance-altering substances. But in the ultra-wealthy, heavily protected realm of professional sports, protecting a billion-dollar brand often takes absolute, unquestionable precedence over complete transparency. Releasing such incredibly damaging, highly scandalous information would have instantly triggered a massive, uncontrollable media firestorm. It would have completely decimated the pristine, highly marketable, incredibly lucrative image of the beloved local franchise. Therefore, a heavy, suffocating blanket of silence was allegedly thrown completely over those highly controversial initial medical charts. We are talking about missing laboratory documents, heavily redacted medical files, and extremely nervous hospital administrators absolutely terrified of multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuits. The brilliant, highly trained doctors who had initially tried to sound the massive alarm were effectively sidelined, entirely silenced by the terrifying threat of legal retaliation and the overwhelming, crushing power of the athletic empire. And while the highly educated medical experts privately argued over heavily guarded test tubes and complex cardiovascular scans, the athlete himself was already actively preparing to make an incredibly fatal choice that would permanently, irrevocably, shatter the grand illusion of his physical invincibility. Let us completely rewind the clock to the 27th of July, 1993. It was a notoriously brutal, suffocatingly hot, and incredibly humid summer afternoon in the state of Massachusetts. The massive, roaring professional arenas were completely silent, locked up tightly for the long off-season. Instead, our heavily scrutinized captain found himself in a remarkably quiet, entirely empty collegiate gymnasium at Brandeis University. There were no flashing television cameras, no heavily opinionated sports commentators, and absolutely no massive cheering sections to witness the horror that was about to unfold. He was wearing simple, deeply comfortable practice gear, casually stepping onto the familiar wooden floor with a close, deeply trusted friend and fellow professional basketball player. They were not playing a grueling, high-stakes scrimmage. They were simply casually shooting the basketball, gently working up a light, entirely manageable sweat. It was the exact same repetitive, deeply comforting physical routine he had performed literally tens of thousands of times since his incredibly rough childhood on the unforgiving asphalt courts of Baltimore. He comfortably caught a crisp pass, squared up his incredibly broad, immensely powerful shoulders, and effortlessly released the leather ball toward the iron rim. But he never even saw the ball gracefully pass through the white net. Without a single desperate sound of physical distress, without any dramatic warning or clutching of his chest, his incredibly strong legs simply folded completely beneath him. He crashed violently, heavily to the heavily polished floor. His terrified friend immediately rushed to his side, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated horror. He frantically screamed for someone, absolutely anyone, to call the emergency medical services. The agonizing minutes that immediately followed were a chaotic, terrifying blur of sheer, helpless panic. Paramedics rushed into the quiet gymnasium, their heavy black boots loudly echoing off the brick walls as they desperately deployed their highly advanced life-saving equipment. They worked frantically, aggressively, pumping his massive chest, heavily relying on every single ounce of their extensive medical training to pull the beloved, deeply adored superstar back from the terrifying brink. But the devastating, irreversible biological damage had already been completely finalized. The absolute worst, heavily suppressed fears of those initially silenced doctors had just agonizingly materialized on that quiet collegiate court. Despite the desperate, frantic efforts of the incredibly skilled emergency responders, his brave, massively damaged heart could not take it. The golden boy of the city had permanently slipped away, leaving behind an incredibly massive, entirely unfillable void and a rapidly brewing storm of explosive, highly scandalous questions that would soon entirely consume the entire sporting world. The news hit the historic, heavily walked streets of Boston like a massive, completely undeniable earthquake. When the devastating morning papers finally hit the local newsstands, an entire region, millions of incredibly passionate, fiercely loyal individuals woke up to a reality they simply could not comprehend. The beloved captain, the extraordinarily polite young man with the brilliant, infectious smile, who had effortlessly carried the immensely heavy hopes of a legendary franchise on his broad shoulders, was permanently gone. The profound, suffocating shock that completely gripped the entire nation was unlike anything the professional sports world had ever witnessed. It was not just the deeply tragic loss of an elite, heavily compensated athlete. It was the sudden, agonizing evaporation of a seemingly limitless, golden future. The subsequent public farewell was a grand, immensely heartbreaking spectacle of epic proportions. Thousands upon thousands of weeping, profoundly devastated fans completely surrounded the massive, heavily guarded arena, standing for countless hours in the sweltering, oppressive summer heat just to pay their final, deeply emotional respects. Inside the cavernous, softly lit building, hardened, fiercely competitive veteran athletes, men who were universally known for their absolute invulnerability, openly wept like small children. The franchise, completely paralyzed by an overwhelming, crushing wave of collective grief, officially and permanently retired his iconic jersey number 35. They slowly raised that massive bright green and white banner to the highest, darkest rafters of the stadium, silently promising the weeping masses that his legendary name would be forever immortalized. For a brief, deeply sorrowful period, it genuinely seemed as though the entire, highly aggressive sports media apparatus had respectfully agreed to let the incredibly grieving family mourn in absolute, undisturbed peace. He was universally hailed as a fallen hero, a magnificent, deeply cherished icon who had simply pushed his physical limits too far. But as we deeply know, in the incredibly ruthless, highly lucrative, and deeply unforgiving world of professional athletics, absolute peace is merely a temporary, highly fragile illusion. The deeply buried, heavily concealed truth was quietly, relentlessly scratching at the heavy wooden door of the locker room. The dark side of fame was completely unwilling to let this devastating story end with a simple, quiet eulogy. A massive, incredibly destructive storm was rapidly brewing just over the horizon, and it was about to completely shatter the sacred, carefully constructed image of the fallen captain. Fast forward exactly 2 years. The year was 1995. The grieving family was still slowly, agonizingly trying to piece their shattered lives back together, completely unaware that a meticulously prepared, highly explosive bombshell was about to be unceremoniously dropped directly onto their front porch. It did not come from a cheap sensationalist local tabloid known for peddling wild, unsubstantiated rumors. No, this incredibly devastating blow came from one of the most highly respected, fiercely analytical, and incredibly prestigious financial publications in the entire country. The massive, heavily researched article hit the morning newsstands, and within absolute minutes, the entire landscape of the story violently shifted. The journalist, citing incredibly highly placed, deeply anonymous medical sources, boldly declared that the secret is out. The article made an absolutely chilling, legally perilous accusation that completely paralyzed the reading public. It claimed that the catastrophic, incredibly sudden failure of the young athlete's immensely powerful heart was not simply a tragic, unavoidable genetic anomaly. Instead, the publication aggressively alleged that the heart damage was directly, undeniably caused by the fact that he heavily suffered from dependency on highly illicit, intensely dangerous chemical stimulants. Can you possibly imagine the sheer, unadulterated chaos that instantly erupted? The masses of loyal fans who had spent the last 2 years deeply revering his pristine, perfectly packaged memory were suddenly thrown into a state of absolute, dizzying confusion and intense, burning anger. How could this incredibly polite, highly disciplined young man, a player universally celebrated for his deafening success and incredibly clean, completely scandal-free public image, secretly be hiding such a terrifying, completely destructive habit? The article aggressively pulled back the heavily sanitized curtain, suggesting that the initial team of elite cardiologists, the ones who had desperately warned him never to play again, had seen unmistakable, deeply alarming chemical markers in his highly confidential blood work. It aggressively implied that his deeply tragic, highly publicized collapse on that quiet summer afternoon was the direct, undeniable consequence of a fatal choice he had made entirely away from the incredibly bright, flashing lights of the professional arena. But before we blindly accept these incredibly explosive, highly damaging accusations as absolute, undeniable gospel, we must ruthlessly dig much deeper into the incredibly murky, highly secretive, and massively profitable underbelly of the professional sports machine. We have to ask the incredibly uncomfortable, legally sensitive questions. Why did these highly educated, deeply respected medical professionals wait 2 entire years to anonymously leak such incredibly sensitive, highly protected medical data? You have to deeply understand the incredibly thick, almost impenetrable wall of absolute silence that tightly surrounds elite, billion-dollar athletic organizations. When a highly marketable, incredibly valuable superstar secretly struggles with deeply dangerous dependencies, the very last thing the wealthy franchise owners want is a massive, completely uncontrollable public relations catastrophe. Millions of dollars in lucrative corporate sponsorships, incredibly expensive broadcasting rights, and massive ticket sales are permanently on the line. Therefore, a deeply toxic, highly secretive culture of looking the completely other way often heavily prevails. Some highly connected, deeply cynical sports analysts openly theorized that the doctors who originally sounded the massive alarm were completely furious. They were intensely angry that their highly expert medical advice was incredibly aggressively ignored, completely bypassed by a second, far more compliant physician who simply told the desperate player exactly what he wanted to hear. They deeply felt that they were being unfairly, heavily blamed in the hushed, private medical circles for failing to prevent the highly publicized tragedy, and they anonymously leaked the deeply scandalous information to brutally clear their own prestigious, heavily guarded professional reputations. But the incredibly grieving, fiercely protective widow of the fallen captain was absolutely not going to sit quietly in the dark shadows and simply allow a major publication to mercilessly, completely destroy the meticulously built, highly respected legacy of the man she loved. She firmly believed with every single fiber of her being that these incredibly devastating rumors were nothing more than a vicious, highly calculated smear campaign designed to sell millions of newspapers and fiercely protect incredibly negligent doctors from massive financial liability. She immediately, aggressively prepared for absolute, uncompromising warfare. She hired a team of incredibly ruthless, highly compensated attorneys, completely ready to drag every single hidden, deeply dirty secret into the unforgiving, brightly lit arena of a federal courtroom. The battle lines were incredibly sharply drawn, and the deeply tragic, highly emotional story was about to become one of the most vicious, highly publicized legal dogfights in the entire history of modern athletics. When the heavy, incredibly imposing wooden doors of the federal courthouse finally swung open, the grieving widow was absolutely transformed. She was no longer just a weeping spouse standing in the dark shadows of a towering athletic legend. She became a fiercely relentless, completely uncompromising warrior, aggressively determined to protect her family's heavily contested legacy. The sheer scale of the legal retaliation was absolutely unprecedented in the incredibly lucrative history of professional sports. She filed massive multi-million-dollar lawsuits, aggressively targeting not only the prestigious publication that dared to print the explosive article, but also the elite medical professionals she firmly believed had catastrophically failed her husband. The courtroom instantly became a highly volatile, completely unforgiving theater of war. The entire nation was deeply captivated as highly compensated, incredibly ruthless attorneys sharply interrogated world-renowned cardiologists under the blinding, intensely hot glare of the national media. The widow incredibly passionately argued that her beloved husband never, ever suffered from dependency on any illicit substances. Instead, her high-powered legal team presented deeply complex, highly technical medical theories suggesting a completely different, entirely innocent culprit. They aggressively asserted that a tragically common, entirely invisible biological virus, the kind that might cause a simple winter cold in an average person, had somehow silently invaded the captain's incredibly powerful cardiovascular system, heavily attacking his heart muscle and ultimately causing the catastrophic failure. They painted a deeply emotional, highly compelling picture of a deeply dedicated family man who simply caught a terrifyingly bad break, a man who found himself in the center of a scandal due to serious accusations that were entirely, maliciously fabricated by people desperately trying to sell newspapers and avoid massive financial ruin. But as the highly aggressive defense attorneys sharply fired back, slowly unrolling massive, highly complex medical charts in front of the deeply divided jury, the absolute unvarnished truth began to look incredibly, terrifyingly murky. Right in the extremely hot, heavily concentrated center of this massive, highly destructive legal inferno stood the highly decorated, incredibly confident physician who had given the fallen captain the ultimate, highly coveted green light to return to the polished hardwood. This specific doctor, a man who had previously enjoyed absolute, unquestioned professional respect, suddenly saw his incredibly lucrative, highly prestigious career heavily dangling by a remarkably thin, incredibly fragile thread. The cross-examinations were absolutely brutal, completely merciless interrogations that aggressively dissected every single highly sensitive conversation he ever had with the superstar. The plaintiff's incredibly aggressive attorneys repeatedly hammered him, fiercely demanding to know how a highly trained, deeply experienced cardiovascular specialist could possibly look at an immensely powerful 27-year-old elite athlete and dismiss deeply alarming, highly irregular test results as mere nervous fainting spells. But the deeply embattled physician absolutely refused to quietly back down. He aggressively launched a highly controversial, entirely shocking defense strategy of his own. He looked directly at the highly attentive jury and fiercely claimed that the immensely wealthy superstar, completely driven by his blinding, highly addictive, deafening success and an absolute, unyielding desperation to maintain his incredibly lucrative contracts, had aggressively, actively concealed vital, highly relevant medical history from him. The doctor firmly insisted that a deeply vital, incredibly necessary foundation of complete, uncompromising honesty is absolutely required between a physician and a patient, and he aggressively alleged that the highly scrutinized athlete had deliberately, purposefully kept him completely in the dark regarding his personal, highly guarded habits. The intensely gripping, incredibly painful courtroom drama forced millions of highly engaged spectators to seriously ponder a deeply unsettling, heavily debated question. Was this deeply respected doctor a tragic, incredibly unfortunate scapegoat, a man heavily manipulated by a deeply desperate superstar? Or was he simply entirely seduced by the incredibly powerful, intensely intoxicating dark side of fame, willingly turning a highly educated blind eye to keep a globally recognized icon on the highly profitable playing field. But perhaps the most terrifying, deeply chilling aspect of this entire, highly publicized ordeal was the immensely heavy, incredibly dense cloud of whispered conspiracies that heavily hovered over the highest, most secretive echelons of the legendary athletic organization. When we deeply examine the highly guarded, heavily protected boardrooms where multi-billion-dollar decisions are quietly made, a deeply sinister, highly unsettling narrative begins to rapidly take shape. We must absolutely remember the devastating, highly traumatic historical context. This specific, incredibly proud franchise had just recently suffered an identical, entirely catastrophic loss when their previous highly touted rookie tragically passed away before ever playing a single professional game. The wealthy owners and highly powerful executives were absolutely terrified of being publicly branded as a deeply negligent, entirely cursed organization that completely failed to protect its most valuable, highly compensated assets. Highly connected, deeply anonymous sports insiders began to quietly, aggressively whisper that the secret is out among the absolute elite circles. They heavily suggested that the incredibly powerful front office was actually fully, entirely aware of the deeply alarming red flags present in the captain's initial, highly confidential medical screenings. The highly controversial, deeply scandalous theory boldly posits that a heavy, entirely unspoken directive was quietly passed down from the absolute top. Heavily suppress the deeply damaging information, completely bury the highly problematic medical tapes, and absolutely find a doctor who will provide a highly convenient, legally safe diagnosis. If these incredibly explosive, highly damaging rumors hold even a single, microscopic ounce of truth, it implies a level of cold, highly calculated corporate ruthlessness that is almost completely impossible to fully comprehend. It suggests that a vibrant, incredibly beloved young man was silently, heavily pushed toward a deeply tragic, completely unavoidable, fatal choice, entirely sacrificed on the highly profitable, incredibly unforgiving altar of corporate public relations and massive financial preservation. And while the highly expensive lawyers fiercely argued over the incredibly complex legal definitions of medical negligence, the tragic, completely undeniable reality remained entirely unchanged. The beautiful, incredibly powerful heart of a genuine hometown hero simply could not take the immense, crushing strain of the heavy secrets he was forced to carry. What exactly drives a young, incredibly wealthy human being, someone who already possesses absolutely everything a person could ever physically desire, to willingly gamble his entire existence on a highly questionable medical opinion? To truly comprehend this deeply tragic puzzle, we must aggressively peel back the highly polished layers of the professional athletic mindset. From the very moment these extraordinary individuals first touch a basketball in their early childhood, they are systematically, rigorously conditioned to believe in their own absolute physical invincibility. They are aggressively taught to ignore agonizing pain, to completely silence the natural warning signals of their own bodies, and to view any form of physical weakness as an unforgivable moral failure. When our beloved captain experienced his deafening success on the grandest, most heavily illuminated professional stages, the intoxicating roar of the masses completely drowned out the quiet, desperate whispers of reality. He was no longer just a young man from Baltimore. He was completely transformed into an untouchable, living deity wrapped in iconic green and white fabric. To accept the terrifying verdict from that first team of elite cardiologists, to suddenly walk away from the game forever, would mean entirely destroying his own deeply ingrained identity. Who exactly was he, if not the fearless leader of the most legendary athletic franchise in the world? This intense, almost blinding psychological desperation perfectly sets the stage for the dark side of fame to permanently take hold. The crushing, unimaginable pressure to continuously perform at a superhuman level, night after grueling night, creates a deeply toxic, highly fragile environment. It is within this incredibly dark, heavily suffocating space that some of the greatest athletes in history have silently suffered from dependency on highly illicit, intensely dangerous chemical substances, desperately seeking an artificial edge or simply a temporary escape from the crushing weight of global expectations. He was ultimately forced to make an incredibly agonizing, fatal choice. He could either safely fade into the quiet, heavily forgotten shadows as a medically retired spectator, or he could aggressively roll the dice, desperately clinging to the highly controversial second opinion that promised him his glittering kingdom back. He chose the blinding spotlight. He chose the perilous roar of the arena. And while we can sit back and heavily judge his deeply tragic decision from the absolute safety of our comfortable living rooms, we must simultaneously recognize the profound, deeply heartbreaking human vulnerability that ultimately sealed his doom. But what exactly happens to a highly manufactured, heavily protected legacy when the bright lights finally turn off and the uncomfortable, scandalous truth begins to aggressively seep through the cracks? The highly explosive, deeply controversial aftermath of his sudden collapse permanently, irrevocably altered the entire multi-billion-dollar landscape of professional sports. The devastating loss of the young captain served as a massive, incredibly terrifying wake-up call for every single athletic organization on the planet. The highly guarded secret is out. The incredibly flawed, heavily compromised medical protocols that allowed a clearly compromised superstar to aggressively shop for a favorable diagnosis were entirely, fundamentally broken. Behind the heavily locked doors of corporate boardrooms, wealthy executives were completely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated terror of massive legal liability. Almost overnight, the entire league aggressively implemented incredibly strict, highly uncompromising cardiac screening procedures. It was a deeply reactive, highly defensive measure, a desperate corporate attempt to ensure that a tragedy of this unimaginable magnitude would never, ever strike the polished hardwood again. But for the grieving, deeply shattered family left completely behind, these sweeping institutional changes offered absolutely no personal comfort. His fiercely loyal widow, a woman who suddenly found herself in the center of a scandal due to serious accusations, aggressively channeled her immense, burning anger and profound sorrow into building a deeply charitable, highly visible foundation in his honored name. She tirelessly worked to completely overwrite the sensationalized, highly damaging tabloid headlines with genuinely beautiful, deeply impactful acts of community service. The foundation aggressively distributed millions of dollars to deeply impoverished neighborhoods, desperately trying to cement his public memory as a generous, highly compassionate hometown hero rather than a deeply flawed, incredibly tragic, cautionary tale. It was a massive, highly emotional battle for the historical narrative, a desperate, loving attempt to fiercely protect the pristine, glowing image of a man whose incredibly brave, massively damaged heart could not take it. Yet, completely despite the beautiful, highly commendable charitable work and the beautifully emotional, highly televised jersey retirement ceremonies, a deeply chilling, incredibly persistent shadow refused to fully dissipate. The intensely vicious, highly publicized legal battles had already successfully unleashed a massive, uncontrollable flood of deeply uncomfortable questions into the public consciousness. And as the heavily passing years slowly turned into entirely new decades, the fiercely passionate fans and highly cynical sports historians were left holding an incredibly complex, deeply fragmented, and highly contradictory puzzle that seemed entirely impossible to fully solve. As we finally quietly step back from this incredibly dark, deeply convoluted, and intensely heartbreaking saga, we are left staring at the legendary, highly polished green parquet floor of that historic Boston arena. That deeply iconic wooden surface silently absorbed his incredibly triumphant gravity-defying leaps, and it also coldly, heavily absorbed his deeply tragic, highly publicized collapse. It is a completely silent, entirely neutral witness to a story that still, to this very day, heavily drips with deeply hidden, highly toxic secrets. Will we ever truly, completely know what deeply alarming chemical markers were quietly hiding inside those initial, highly classified blood tests? Will the brilliant, highly educated medical professionals who were fiercely bound by incredibly strict confidentiality agreements and the terrifying threat of multi-million-dollar corporate lawsuits ever step completely out of the dark shadows to finally, unequivocally, tell the absolute unvarnished truth? Or was the incredibly powerful, deeply wealthy athletic empire simply too massive, too historically influential, to ever allow its darkest, most heavily protected skeletons to fully see the light of day? The profoundly heartbreaking, highly tragic story of the young man from Baltimore is not merely a tale about the sudden, devastating loss of athletic brilliance. It is a deeply haunting, incredibly uncomfortable mirror aggressively held up to our own collective, societal obsession with highly manufactured, physical perfection. We demand absolutely everything from our deeply worshipped heroes, aggressively pushing them to the absolute, terrifying edge of their human capabilities, only to feign complete, absolute ignorance when they inevitably, tragically shatter under the immense, crushing weight. The next time you find yourself deeply mesmerized by the blindingly bright lights of a massive professional arena, watching a deeply gifted, highly compensated athlete effortlessly perform entirely superhuman, gravity-defying feats, take a very long, incredibly quiet moment to pause. Look far past the highly polished, beautifully packaged, multi-billion-dollar spectacle. Remember the deeply tragic, highly cautionary tale of the beloved captain. And ask yourself this incredibly chilling, entirely unanswerable question. Exactly how much deeply concealed, intensely painful human suffering are we absolutely willing to completely ignore just to keep the beautiful, highly entertaining illusion fully alive?